The Tyranids are coming, and they won't stop until they have consumed every living being on Earth. This nightmare scenario of a Tyranid invasion reveals the sheer scale and brutality of this alien threat. Imagine a sky filled with countless bioengineered horrors descending upon Earth. The terrifying vision of a Tyranid invasion and the devastating consequences for humanity. Our planet Earth, home to nearly 10 billion souls, a vibrant biosphere teeming with life in countless forms, a world of oceans and forests, deserts and tundras, a world that has endured for billions of years. But what if all of this, everything we've built, everything we are, could be wiped away in a matter of months? To understand the magnitude of the Tyranid threat, we must first understand what they are. The origins of the Tyranids remain largely unknown. They come from beyond our galaxy, perhaps from the intergalactic void itself, drawn to our Milky Way by some inexplicable cosmic beacon. What we do know is their purpose: consumption, total and complete consumption of all biomass. The Tyranids are the ultimate predator species, engineered or evolved for one singular purpose: to feed. Tyranid biology defies conventional understanding. They are not individual creatures in the way we understand life. Rather, each Tyranid organism is but a cell in a vast, galaxy-spanning superorganism. From the smallest ripper to the largest hive ship, each serves a specific function within the greater whole. Their genetic structure is a marvel of biological engineering. Tyranids possess the ability to rapidly adapt at the genetic level, incorporating useful biological traits from the species they consume. This makes them increasingly difficult to combat as an invasion progresses. They literally evolve countermeasures to our defenses in real time. The scale of a Tyranid invasion is almost impossible to comprehend. A full hive fleet consists of thousands, perhaps millions of bioships, each one a living organism. These range from small escort creatures to massive hive ships that can span kilometers in length. And within each ship are countless warrior organisms, from the diminutive but numerous gaunts to the monstrous carnifexes and tyrannifexes. A single hive fleet contains trillions of individual organisms, all working in perfect harmony toward the singular goal of consumption. They travel between star systems in a state of biostasis, awakening as they approach their prey worlds. The pattern of a Tyranid invasion is well established. They target life-rich worlds, descending upon them like a biblical plague. They consume not just the living organisms, but everything: plant life, animal life, even the very minerals and chemicals that could support life. They absorb the planet's atmosphere, drain its oceans, and leave behind nothing but a barren rock, stripped of everything that could support or sustain life. Entire planetary ecosystems reduced to lifeless husks in a matter of months. Hundreds of worlds have already fallen to their insatiable hunger, and now they have set their sights on Earth. Perhaps most terrifying of all Tyranid attributes is the hive mind, a collective consciousness that links every Tyranid organism across the galaxy. This psychic gestalt entity is of incalculable intelligence, orchestrating the actions of trillions of organisms with perfect synchronicity. The hive mind operates beyond human comprehension. It has no emotions as we understand them, no mercy, no remorse, no concept of cruelty or compassion. It has only hunger, endless, insatiable hunger. Human psychers, though sensitive to psychic phenomena, report feeling its presence as a vast, yawning emptiness, a psychic shadow that devours light and hope. They describe it as an endless void, a hunger so profound that it threatens to consume not just flesh, but consciousness itself. Some theorize that the hive mind is not merely hungry, but actively malevolent, that it takes a predatory pleasure in the consumption of sentient species. Others suggest it is simply operating on a level of existence so alien to our own that concepts like good and evil are meaningless when applied to it. Regardless of its true nature, the implications of facing such an entity are clear. The Tyranid hive mind coordinates its forces with a level of strategic and tactical precision that no human military could hope to match. It does not make mistakes. It does not hesitate. It does not fear death. For what is the loss of a few million drones to an entity comprised of trillions? And perhaps most terrifying of all is the simple truth the Tyranids learn. Each world they consume adds to their biological knowledge. Each species they devour contributes new genetic material to their ever-expanding arsenal of biological weapons. Each defeat, and they have been defeated, though rarely, teaches them new strategies, new adaptations. They are coming for Earth, and they are hungry. How would we first detect the approach of a Tyranid hive fleet? Not with our traditional astronomical instruments. The bioships of the Tyranids do not emit the typical signatures we associate with spacecraft. No engine emissions, no radiation spikes, nothing that our early warning systems are designed to detect. The first sign would likely be subtle anomalies in our deep space observations, unexplained shadows moving against the stars, strange gravitational distortions, unusual patterns of stellar dimming that don't match known phenomena, like planetary transits. Astronomers would debate the significance of these observations. Papers would be published proposing various natural explanations, perhaps a previously unknown form of interstellar medium, perhaps a new class of rogue planets. The truth would be too fantastic, too terrifying to consider. The second sign would be felt rather than seen. In the Warhammer universe, the approach of a Tyranid hive fleet is heralded by what is known as the shadow in the warp, a psychic phenomenon that disrupts all forms of faster-than-light communication and distorts psychic abilities. In our world, perhaps the closest analog would be unexplained disruptions in our global communications networks. Satellite communications would experience increasing degradation. Wireless signals would be plagued by strange interference patterns. Internet connections would become unstable, with data packets lost to the void. All of this would be dismissed as technical issues, solar flare activity, or cyber attacks by hostile nations. But there would be other, more disturbing signs. Around the world, sensitive individuals would begin experiencing nightmares of unprecedented intensity, dreams of endless hunger, of skies filled with writhing shapes, of the earth itself being devoured piece by piece. Psychiatric wards would report a surge in patients suffering from similar delusions, visions of an impending apocalypse, of monsters descending from the stars. Some would recognize these symptoms for what they truly are, the psychic pressure of the approaching hive mind, but their warnings would be dismissed as the ravings of doomsayers and lunatics. After all, we know that psychic phenomena don't exist, don't we? As the hive fleet draws closer, these effects would intensify. The shadow in the warp would grow stronger, causing widespread communications blackouts. The dreams would become more vivid, more terrifying, affecting even those not typically sensitive to such things. Cases of unexplained mass hysteria would be reported around the globe, and then, finally, our conventional detection systems would register something. A massive swarm of objects entering the outer reaches of our solar system. moving at impossible speeds, defying the laws of physics as we understand them, too numerous to count, too large to ignore. The world's governments would finally acknowledge the threat, though they would still not understand its true nature. Emergency meetings of the United Nations Security Council would be convened. Military forces worldwide would be placed on high alert. Astronomers and scientists would work around the clock to determine the nature of these objects. But it would already be too late. The vanguard of the Tyranid invasion would have already arrived. The first physical contact would not be with the massive bioships or the monstrous creatures that populate our nightmares. It would be with something much smaller, much more insidious. Tyranid spores. Microscopic organisms drifting through our upper atmosphere, carried by global air currents to every corner of the Earth. These spores would begin the process of genetic sampling, analyzing our biosphere, cataloging our DNA, preparing the way for the invasion to come. They would be too small to detect, too numerous to counter. By the time we realized they were here, they would have already begun their work. Next would come the vanguard organisms, the genestealers and their ilk. These creatures, specially adapted for infiltration and reconnaissance, would make planetfall in remote regions, the depths of the Amazon rainforest, the Siberian wilderness, the Australian outback, places where they could establish themselves without immediate detection. From these hidden enclaves, they would begin to spread, adapting to Earth's environment, learning our weaknesses, preparing the way for the main invasion force. Some might even infiltrate human population centers, using their unique biology to subvert and control human hosts. All of this would happen in near silence, with only the most astute observers noting the strange disappearances, the unusual animal behavior, the inexplicable ecological changes occurring in these remote regions. By the time mainstream science took notice, these vanguard forces would be firmly established, and all the while the main body of the Hive Fleet would draw ever closer, its massive bioships now visible to our telescopes as they approach the inner solar system. The world would watch in horror as these living vessels, each larger than the largest human spacecraft ever built, positioned themselves in Earth orbit. The invasion was about to begin in earnest. The moment of true first contact would be sudden and devastating. From the massive bioships in orbit, the Tyranids would launch their assault, not with bombs or missiles, but with living delivery systems, mycetic spores. These massive organic drop pods would rain down upon Earth by the millions, each containing a lethal payload of Tyranid warrior organisms. Unlike a conventional military invasion, the Tyranids would not focus solely on strategic targets, military bases, government centers, population hubs. They would land everywhere, urban centers and wilderness alike. Their goal is not conquest, but consumption, and all biomass is equally valuable to the hive mind. The initial landings would cause widespread panic and confusion. Emergency services would be overwhelmed. Military forces, prepared for conventional warfare, would find themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had trained to combat. An enemy that doesn't use vehicles or weapons in the traditional sense, but is itself a weapon. Every part of its biology engineered for killing and consuming. The first human encounters with Tyranid warrior organisms would be nightmarish. Termagants and hormagaunts, the rank-and-file troops of the Tyranid swarm, would rampage through civilian populations, slaughtering indiscriminately. Larger creatures like warriors and carnifexes would demolish military resistance with terrifying ease. our conventional weapons would prove effective initially. Bullets can still tear Tyranid flesh. Explosives can still rupture their alien bodies. But for every creature killed, 10 more would take its place. The Tyranids' numbers would be simply too vast, their advance too relentless, for conventional tactics to halt. And with each engagement, the Tyranids would adapt. The hive mind, observing through the senses of its countless organisms, would analyze our weapons, our tactics, our weaknesses. It would begin to evolve countermeasures, thicker carapaces to resist bullets, specialized organisms to counter our vehicular advantages, bioweapons tailored to human physiology. Within days of the initial landings, the Tyranids would establish their first major biological structures on Earth, massive, pulsating growths that would begin to transform the surrounding environment. Capillary towers would rise into the sky, spewing spores to alter our atmosphere. Reclamation pools would form, bubbling cauldrons of digestive enzymes where captured biomass, both human and otherwise, would be broken down into its component nutrients. Around these structures, the Tyranids would spread a living carpet of alien tissue, the dreaded hive terrain. This biological construct would spread outward from each landing site, consuming and replacing Earth's natural ecosystem. Plants would be dissolved and replaced with alien fungi. Animals would be hunted to extinction. The very soil would be digested and reconstituted into forms better suited to the Tyranids' purposes. Human military forces would attempt to destroy these growing hive nodes, recognizing them as critical infrastructure for the invaders. Airstrikes, artillery bombardments, even tactical nuclear weapons in some cases. These attacks would meet with limited success. The Tyranids would quickly evolve specialized defense organisms, living anti-aircraft batteries, burrowing creatures that could intercept subterranean charges, spore clouds that could neutralize radiation. As these initial beachheads expanded, the true horror of the Tyranid invasion would become apparent. This was not a war for territory or resources, as humans understand such conflicts. This was consumption on a planetary scale. The Tyranids weren't trying to defeat us. They were trying to devour us, along with every other living thing on Earth. The early battles would be chaotic and desperate. Tanks firing at point-blank range into waves of chitinous horrors. Infantry positions overrun by living carpets of claws and fangs. Air forces engaging flying Tyranid organisms in desperate aerial combat. In some engagements, human forces would hold their ground. In most, they would be forced into retreat. And with each passing day, more mycetic spores would rain from the sky. More hive nodes would be established. More territory would fall under the shadow of the hive mind. The invasion would accelerate, feeding on itself, growing stronger with each victory. Within weeks, large portions of the Earth's surface would be transformed into alien landscapes. Major cities would fall, their populations consumed or scattered. Military forces would be in retreat globally, establishing defensive perimeters around the remaining human strongholds. The Tyranid invasion would have moved beyond first contact and into a full-scale planetary assault, and humanity would be losing. While the chaos of the initial invasion unfolded on Earth's surface, a more subtle but equally terrifying process would be occurring on a strategic level. The hive mind, that vast alien intelligence that coordinates every aspect of the Tyranid invasion, would be implementing a comprehensive strategy for the complete consumption of our world. Unlike human military strategists, the hive mind does not think in terms of victory and defeat, of capturing territory or securing resources. It thinks in terms of efficient consumption. The fastest, most effective way to process all available biomass and convert it into new Tyranid organisms. The first phase of this strategy would already be complete: the establishment of initial hive nodes across the planet. These biological fortresses serve as processing centers, converting captured biomass into new Tyranid creatures, tailored specifically for Earth's conditions. The second phase would now begin: the systematic dismantling of human resistance. The hive mind would have already analyzed our military capabilities, our command structures, our technological advantages. It would now deploy specialized organisms to counter each of these factors. To combat our air superiority, the Tyranids would release swarms of gargoyles and harpies, flying organisms that could overwhelm fighter jets through sheer numbers and neutralize bombers before they could reach their targets. Our naval advantages would be countered by massive aquatic creatures that would rise from the depths to drag ships into the abyss. Most insidious would be the Tyranids' attack on our command structure. Specialized infiltration organisms, enhanced genestealers and lictors, would be deployed to assassinate military leaders, disrupt communication centers, and sow confusion among the remaining human forces. These creatures, capable of chameleonic camouflage and possessing superhuman strength and speed, would strike without warning, often from within supposedly secure facilities. The third phase of the hive mind strategy would focus on the acceleration of environmental transformation. As more of Earth's surface fell under Tyranid control, the rate of atmospheric and oceanic change would increase. The air would become thicker, laden with alien spores. The oceans would grow murky with Tyranid microorganisms, their chemistry altered to better support alien life. This environmental transformation would have two purposes: to make Earth more hospitable for Tyranid organisms and less habitable for humans and native Earth life. It would become increasingly difficult for unprotected humans to survive in Tyranid-controlled regions. Respiratory diseases would spread as people's lungs struggled to cope with the changing atmosphere. Water supplies would be contaminated by alien microbes. The very ground would become toxic to human life. The fourth phase would be the deployment of specialized consumer organisms. With military resistance fragmented and the environment increasingly hostile to human survival, the Tyranids would release vast swarms of rippers, small, unintelligent creatures designed for one purpose: the consumption of biomass. These living digestive systems would sweep across the landscape in uncountable numbers, devouring everything in their path. Forests would be reduced to bare earth in hours. Abandoned cities would be stripped of every trace of organic material. Even the bodies of the fallen would be consumed, their biomass returning to the Hive Fleet through the capillary towers. Throughout all these phases, the hive mind would continuously adapt its forces to counter human strategies. If we developed a particularly effective weapon against one type of Tyranid organism, that organism would evolve new defenses within days. If we found a safe haven that seemed resistant to Tyranid infiltration, new organisms would be engineered specifically to breach those defenses. This adaptive capacity would be perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Tyranid invasion. Human military doctrine relies on identifying enemy weaknesses and exploiting them. But the Tyranids have no fixed weaknesses, or rather, any weakness, once discovered, is quickly eliminated through accelerated evolution. The hive mind strategy would also include psychological warfare, though not in any form we would recognize. The constant psychic pressure of the shadow in the warp would intensify, driving sensitive individuals to madness and causing widespread despair even among those not normally susceptible to psychic phenomena. The very presence of the hive mind would be an assault on human consciousness, a constant reminder of our insignificance in the face of this cosmic predator. As the invasion progressed, the coordination between Tyranid organisms would become increasingly evident. Different species would work in perfect concert, complementing each other's abilities with a level of synchronization no human army could match. Assault creatures would break enemy lines, allowing infiltration specialists to penetrate defensive positions. Flying organisms would provide air cover for ground forces. Massive creatures would act as mobile artillery, bombarding targets from afar with bioplasma and acid spores. This wasn't merely good coordination, it was perfect unity of purpose. Every organism an extension of the single vast intelligence that is the hive mind. And against such an enemy, human military tactics, developed over millennia of fighting other humans, would prove woefully inadequate. The hive mind strategy would be implacable, adaptive, and utterly without mercy. And as each phase of the invasion unfolded, the simple truth would become increasingly clear. This was not a war humanity could win through conventional means. The Tyranid invasion would mark the beginning of the most devastating biological warfare campaign in Earth's history. Unlike human bioweapons, designed to target specific populations or achieve limited strategic objectives, the Tyranid biological assault would be comprehensive and planetary in scale. The first stage of this biological warfare would be atmospheric. The towering capillary spires established during the initial invasion would continuously release specialized spores into Earth's atmosphere. These microscopic organisms would begin the process of atmospheric conversion, altering the chemical composition of our air to better suit Tyranid biology. Oxygen levels would gradually decrease, while carbon dioxide and methane would increase. New compounds, entirely alien to Earth's natural chemistry, would appear in the air. These changes would occur slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but would accelerate as more of the planet fell under Tyranid control. For humans, the effects would be debilitating. Breathing would become more difficult, especially during physical exertion. Chronic respiratory conditions would develop even among those previously healthy. Gas masks and oxygen supplies would become essential survival equipment, but even these would offer only temporary protection as the alien spores evolved to penetrate filtration systems. The second stage would target Earth's hydrosphere. Tyranid organisms would be released into the oceans, lakes, and rivers. Specialized creatures designed to transform these waters into nutrient solutions better suited for alien consumption. The oceans would grow cloudy, then begin to change color as alien microorganisms multiplied exponentially. Marine life would die off in mass extinction events that would dwarf anything in Earth's geological history. Freshwater sources would be particularly targeted, as the Tyranids would recognize their critical importance to human survival. Water treatment facilities would find themselves dealing with biological contaminants unlike anything they were designed to filter. Within weeks of the invasion, finding potable water would become a major challenge for survivors. The third, and perhaps most horrifying stage of the biological warfare campaign would directly target terrestrial life, including humans. The Tyranids would release parasitic organisms, microscopic invaders that could infiltrate the bodies of Earth creatures, altering their biology from within. In animals, these parasites would cause aggressive behavior, driving infected creatures to attack humans and each other, increasing the chaos and making survival even more difficult. In plants, They would accelerate decay, causing crops to fail and forests to die back at an alarming rate. But the effects on humans would be the most nightmarish. The parasitic invasion would begin subtly, unusual symptoms that might be mistaken for conventional illness: fever, disorientation, muscle pain. But as the parasites multiplied and spread throughout the body, more disturbing changes would manifest. The infected would experience intense hunger, driving them to consume almost anything organic. Their skin would develop a waxy, pallid quality. Their eyes would grow cloudy. Their behavior would become erratic, then increasingly aggressive. In the final stages, physical mutations would become apparent: the growth of chitinous plates beneath the skin, elongation of teeth and nails, development of rudimentary extra limbs. These weren't mere symptoms. They were the beginning of transformation. The Tyranid parasites wouldn't simply kill their hosts. They would attempt to convert them into hybrid organisms, part human and part Tyranid. Most of these conversions would fail, resulting in death. But some would progress further, creating monstrosities that retain just enough of their human intelligence to be used as tools by the hive mind. These infected humans would serve multiple purposes in the Tyranid invasion. They would act as infiltrators, able to pass as human until the later stages of infection. They would serve as psychological weapons, forcing uninfected humans to confront the horror of seeing loved ones transformed into alien monstrosities. And ultimately, they would provide the Tyranids with valuable genetic material, allowing the hive mind to better understand human biology and develop more effective bioweapons. Medical facilities would be overwhelmed trying to treat the infected. Conventional treatments, antibiotics, antivirals, antifungals, would prove useless against the alien parasites. Quarantine procedures would slow the spread, but couldn't stop it entirely. Within months, the parasitic infection would reach pandemic proportions, affecting a significant percentage of the surviving human population. The fourth stage of the biological warfare campaign would target Earth's soil itself. Specialized Tyranid organisms would burrow into the ground, releasing digestive enzymes that would break down the complex soil ecology that supports terrestrial life. The rich, diverse microbial communities that make soil fertile would be replaced with alien microorganisms that serve the hive mind's purposes. The effects would be devastating for agriculture. Crops would fail globally as soil fertility plummeted. Even hardy weeds would struggle to grow in the increasingly alien soil chemistry. Combined with the atmospheric changes and water contamination, this would create a global famine, unlike anything in human history. As all these processes advanced, Earth's biosphere would undergo a transformation so profound it would be visible from space. The green of forests and grasslands would give way to the purplish red of Tyranid hive terrain. The blue of oceans would turn murky brown, then an alien crimson. White clouds would take on yellowish or greenish tints as the atmosphere filled with alien spores. This wasn't merely an invasion, it was a planetary-scale terraforming project, with Earth being remade in the image of whatever distant world spawned the Tyranid menace. And for the native life of Earth, including humanity, the new environment would be fundamentally incompatible with survival. The biological warfare waged by the Tyranids would be comprehensive, multifaceted, and conducted with the cold efficiency that characterizes all hive mind operations. There would be no negotiation, no limitation of harmful effects, no concern for collateral damage, concepts that have at least theoretical relevance in human biological warfare. For the Tyranids, The biological assault on Earth's ecosystems wouldn't be warfare in the conventional sense at all. It would simply be consumption, conducted on a planetary scale. In the face of the overwhelming Tyranid onslaught, humanity would not surrender without a fight. The history of our species is filled with examples of desperate resistance against seemingly insurmountable odds, and the Tyranid invasion would provoke the most determined resistance effort ever mounted. Initially, the response would be conventional. The world's military forces would deploy their standard weapons and tactics: tanks, aircraft, artillery, infantry. In the earlier stages of the invasion, these would achieve some success. Conventional firearms could still kill smaller Tyranid organisms. Heavy weapons could bring down even the larger creatures with concentrated fire. Airstrikes could destroy emerging hive nodes before they fully established themselves. But as the invasion progressed, these conventional approaches would prove increasingly ineffective. The sheer numbers of the Tyranid swarm would overwhelm even the most well-defended positions, and the hive mind's adaptive capabilities would quickly reduce the effectiveness of any weapon or tactic that proved initially successful. Human military strategists would be forced to innovate, to develop new weapons and tactics specifically designed to combat the Tyranid threat. Research facilities around the world, those that remained operational, would work feverishly to understand Tyranid biology and identify potential weaknesses. Some promising avenues would emerge. Flamethrowers and incendiary weapons would prove consistently effective, as Tyranid organisms, despite their adaptability, remained vulnerable to extreme heat. Chemical weapons targeting the unique biochemistry of the Tyranids would be developed, although their use would raise moral questions and risks to Earth's already struggling biosphere. Most significant would be the development of weapons targeting the Tyranids' unique neural structures. Scientists would discover that the synapse creatures, those special organisms through which the hive mind exercises direct control over the swarm, represented a critical vulnerability. If these creatures could be eliminated, the lesser organisms under their control would become disorganized and far less effective. Special forces units would be formed with the specific mission of identifying and eliminating synapse creatures. These elite squads would operate behind enemy lines, in territory already consumed by the Tyranid swarm, conducting high-risk surgical strikes against priority targets. Their casualty rates would be enormous, but their successes, limited though they might be, would represent some of humanity's few victories in this one-sided war. As conventional military resistance faltered, guerrilla warfare would become increasingly important. Survivors in Tyranid-controlled regions would form resistance cells, using hit-and-run tactics against Tyranid-feeding groups and attacking vulnerable biostructures. These guerrilla fighters would develop an intimate knowledge of Tyranid behavior patterns, learning to predict movements and identify vulnerabilities that conventional military forces, with their more rigid doctrines, might miss. These resistance fighters would face challenges beyond anything experienced by guerrilla movements in human conflicts. The Tyranids would not be deterred by casualties. The death of 1,000 organisms would be meaningless to the hive mind. Psychological warfare would be useless against an enemy with no recognizable psychology. And the constantly evolving nature of the Tyranid swarm would mean that tactics that worked one day might be biomass ineffective the next. Nevertheless, these resistance movements would achieve some remarkable successes. They would develop techniques for contaminating Tyranid feeding grounds with toxic substances, poisoning the biomass the invaders sought to consume. They would discover methods for disrupting the psychic signals through which the hive mind controlled its forces, creating temporary zones of confusion that could be exploited for quick strikes. They would become experts at attracting Tyranid attention to decoy targets, while conducting their real operations elsewhere. But perhaps the most important role of these resistance movements would be intelligence gathering. By observing the Tyranids up close, over extended periods, they would develop insights into the aliens' behavior that would be invaluable to the remaining scientific community. This intelligence would contribute to the development of more effective weapons and defensive measures, giving humanity a fighting chance, however slim. Beyond military resistance, there would be scientific efforts to combat the Tyranid biological warfare. Researchers working in secure facilities would race to develop countermeasures to the atmospheric contamination, water pollution, and parasitic infections being spread by the invaders. Progress would be made on treatment protocols for those in the early stages of parasitic infection. While not a cure, these treatments could slow the progression of the disease, giving victims more time and preserving their humanity longer. Atmospheric filtration systems would be improved, allowing some underground facilities to maintain Earth-normal conditions despite the deteriorating environment outside. Water purification technologies would advance rapidly, driven by the desperate need for clean drinking water. Some of the most important scientific work would focus on the Tyranids themselves, understanding their biology, their weaknesses, their methods of communication. This research would be conducted under the most challenging conditions imaginable, with resources dwindling and Tyranid forces constantly threatening even the most secure facilities. Breakthroughs would be made. Researchers would discover that certain frequencies of electromagnetic radiation disrupted Tyranid communication systems. They would develop compounds that were toxic specifically to Tyranid organisms, while having minimal impact on Earth life. They would create more efficient methods for detecting Tyranid infiltration organisms before they could penetrate secure areas. But the most significant scientific effort would be the attempt to understand and counter the hive mind itself. This psychic entity, this vast alien intelligence, represented both the Tyranids' greatest strength and potentially their greatest vulnerability. If it could be blocked, confused, or even directly attacked, the entire invasion might be disrupted. This research would venture into areas previously considered fringe science: psychic phenomena, consciousness studies, technologies designed to detect and influence mental activities. Some would yield promising results. Devices would be developed that could amplify human psychic potential, allowing specially trained individuals to establish limited defenses against the shadow in the warp. Compounds would be synthesized that could enhance psychic abilities in those who possess them, creating weapons of assault against the hive mind. As conventional civilization crumbled, new forms of human organization would emerge to continue the resistance. Military remnants, scientific enclaves, and civilian survival groups would form complex networks, sharing resources and information. These networks would be decentralized by necessity. Any centralized command structure would quickly become a target for Tyranid assassin organisms. Leadership would emerge from unexpected quarters. Military officers who demonstrated adaptability rather than rigid adherence to doctrine. Scientists who could bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Ordinary civilians who displayed extraordinary courage and resourcefulness in the face of the alien threat. These leaders would inspire continued resistance even as the situation grew increasingly dire. They would remind their followers that humanity had faced extinction-level threats before: ice ages, supervolcanoes, pandemic diseases, and had survived through ingenuity and determination. They would point to the small victories being won, the Tyranid weaknesses being discovered, the defenses being improved. And some would dare to speak of counterattack, of not merely surviving the Tyranid onslaught, but actually driving the invaders from Earth. Such talk might seem like delusion in the face of the overwhelming Tyranid advance, but it would serve a crucial purpose: maintaining hope. And in the darkest days of the invasion, hope would be as important a resource as weapons or food. The human resistance to the Tyranid invasion would be fragmented, improvised, and often desperate. It would suffer more defeats than victories. It would lose ground steadily to the relentless alien advance, but it would fight on, adapting, innovating, refusing to surrender to despair. In the face of an impossible foe, humanity would discover reserves of courage, ingenuity, and determination that had never before been tested. Whether these would be enough remained to be seen. As the Tyranid invasion progressed from its initial beachheads to a full planetary assault, human civilization as we know it would begin to collapse. This wouldn't be a sudden event, but a cascading series of failures that would accelerate as the alien advance continued. The first systems to fail would be global communications and transportation networks. The physical infrastructure of these networks, satellite dishes, transmission towers, airports, seaports, railways, would be prime targets for Tyranid attack, both for their strategic value and for the refined metals and materials they contain. More insidiously, the shadow in the warp would create increasing interference in electronic communications, making coordination between surviving human enclaves increasingly difficult. With global transportation severely compromised, international trade would collapse almost entirely. Nations and regions would be thrown back on their own resources, many of which would be inadequate for sustaining their populations. The global just-in-time supply chain that keeps modern cities functioning would break down, leading to critical shortages of essential goods. The world's financial systems, already stressed by the initial chaos of the invasion, would completely collapse as physical infrastructure was destroyed and electronic networks became unreliable. Currency would quickly become worthless in many areas, replaced by barter systems focusing on immediately useful goods: food, medicine, weapons, fuel. Major population centers would face particularly severe challenges. Modern cities depend on the constant influx of resources: food, water, electricity, fuel, from outside their boundaries. As transportation networks failed, these resources would dwindle rapidly. The situation would be exacerbated by the flood of refugees from Tyranid-controlled areas, swelling urban populations beyond sustainable levels. Some cities would attempt to hold out through a combination of military defense and emergency self-sufficiency measures. Vacant lots and parks would be converted to urban farms. Water rationing would be implemented. Power would be generated locally through whatever means were available: solar panels, wind turbines, diesel generators running on dwindling fuel supplies. But most major cities would ultimately prove indefensible. Their size and density, advantages in human conflicts, would be liabilities against the Tyranids. Large population centers would represent concentrated biomass, prime targets for the insatiable hunger of the Hive Fleet, and the complex infrastructure that makes cities function would be vulnerable to infiltration by specialized Tyranid organisms. The fall of each major city would follow a similar pattern. First, the outlying areas would be overrun, pushing surviving populations into an increasingly crowded core. Defense perimeters would be established, manned by a combination of military forces and civilian volunteers. For a time, these defenses might hold, especially if the city had natural barriers like rivers or mountains that could be incorporated into the defensive strategy. But eventually, the perimeter would be breached, either by a massive frontal assault that overwhelmed the defenders through sheer numbers, or by infiltration organisms bypassing the defenses entirely. Once inside the perimeter, Tyranid forces would spread rapidly through the dense urban environment, consuming everything in their path. The final stages would be nightmarish. Desperate last stands in hardened buildings, mass evacuation attempts that quickly degenerated into panicked stampedes, the release of chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons in last-ditch efforts to deny the Tyranids their prize. But in the end, the result would be the same. Another city consumed, its population and infrastructure converted into biomass for the ever-growing Tyranid swarm. As cities fell, national governments would begin to collapse. Some would relocate to smaller, more defensible locations. Others would fragment, with regional authorities taking control of their localities as central command structures failed. Still others would simply cease to function as their leadership was killed or scattered by the Tyranid advance. The military forces of these failing nations would continue to fight, even without central coordination. Battlefield commanders would assume greater autonomy, making tactical decisions based on local conditions rather than strategic directives from a command structure that no longer existed. These isolated military units would often align themselves with local civilian authorities or survival groups, providing protection in exchange for resources. But even the most advanced military forces would find themselves increasingly outmatched as the invasion progressed. Modern warfare depends heavily on sophisticated technology. Satellite reconnaissance, drone surveillance, precision-guided munitions, networked command and control systems. As this technology failed due to infrastructure destruction and Tyranid interference, military effectiveness would decrease dramatically. More fundamentally, modern military doctrine is designed for conflicts between human forces, with human psychology and limitations in mind. Concepts like strategic bombing to break enemy morale, economic sanctions to limit war-making capacity, or psychological operations to influence behavior would be useless against the Tyranids. They have no morale to break, no economy to disrupt, no psychology to influence. The collapse of conventional military forces would be accompanied by the rise of irregular fighting groups. Some would be organized remnants of regular military units, maintaining discipline and doctrine despite their isolation. Others would be civilian militia groups, often centered around charismatic leaders. Still others would be little more than armed gangs, as concerned with controlling scarce resources as with fighting the alien threat. These irregular forces would develop innovative tactics better suited to combating the Tyranid menace than conventional military approaches. They would become experts at identifying Tyranid weaknesses, exploiting the brief periods of confusion that followed the death of Synapse creatures, and using the alien terrain against its creators. Their effectiveness would vary widely, but some would achieve remarkable successes against vastly superior Tyranid numbers. As civilizational collapse accelerated, new forms of human organization would emerge from the chaos. Survival enclaves would form, often in remote or naturally defensible locations. These communities would combine military defense, food production, and scientific research in self-contained units. The most successful would develop effective strategies for detecting and eliminating Tyranid infiltration attempts, preserving their security even as the world around them fell to the alien advance. These enclaves would vary tremendously in their governance, resources, and survival strategies. Some would be democratic, making decisions through consensus or elected leadership. Others would be authoritarian, with power concentrated in the hands of military commanders or self-appointed leaders. Some would welcome refugees, valuing the skills and labor they brought. Others would violently repel any outsiders, viewing them as potential carriers of Tyranid parasites or simply as threats to limited resources. Despite their isolation, these enclaves would attempt to maintain contact with one another, establishing rudimentary communication networks using technologies resistant to Tyranid interference, low-frequency radio, hardwired telephone lines, even human messengers in the most desperate cases. Through these networks, they would share crucial information, Tyranid movements, effective weapons and tactics, treatment protocols for the infected. As conventional nations collapsed, these networked enclaves would represent the new face of human civilization, fragmented, embattled, but stubbornly persistent. They would preserve not just human lives, but human knowledge, culture, and hope for eventual victory against the alien threat. But the hard truth would remain. With each passing day, more territory would fall under Tyranid control. More biomass would be consumed and converted into new alien organisms. More of Earth's atmosphere and hydrosphere would be transformed to suit Tyranid biology. The enclaves, for all their resilience, would be islands in an ever-rising tide of alien consumption. The fall of nations would not be the end of humanity, but it would mark the end of human dominance over Earth, a status our species had maintained for thousands of years. We would be reduced to scattered survivors on a planet increasingly hostile to our very existence, fighting a desperate rearguard action against an enemy that saw us as nothing more than another form of biomass to be consumed. And still, the main body of the Tyranid Hive Fleet would continue its relentless advance, drawn by the psychic beacon that had brought it to our world in the first place. The worst was yet to come. With conventional military resistance failing and civilization collapsing, humanity would be forced to consider increasingly desperate measures in its fight for survival against the Tyranid onslaught. These would include not only extreme weapons, but fundamental changes in how we approach the conflict, and perhaps in what it meant to be human. The most obvious extreme measure would be the deployment of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological, against the Tyranid swarm. These weapons, designed for the most desperate circumstances of human conflict, would now be turned against the alien threat. Nuclear weapons would prove effective in the short term, capable of destroying large concentrations of Tyranid organisms and rendering areas temporarily uninhabitable even for the highly adaptable invaders. Strategic nuclear strikes would be used to eliminate major hive nodes, disrupting the Tyranids' ability to process and distribute the biomass they consumed. But this effectiveness would come at a terrible cost. The environmental damage caused by widespread nuclear detonations would further compromise Earth's already struggling biosphere. Radiation zones would render large aerodrome areas uninhabitable for humans as well as Tyranids. And the nuclear arsenal of even the most well-equipped nations would eventually be exhausted against the seemingly endless numbers of the Tyranid swarm. Chemical weapons would be deployed on a scale never before seen in warfare. From persistent blister agents to rapidly lethal nerve gases, the full spectrum of chemical weaponry would be unleashed against the Tyranids. Scientists would work to develop new compounds specifically tailored to Tyranid biology, creating chemical agents that targeted their unique physiological vulnerabilities. these chemical attacks would achieve variable results. Some compounds would prove highly effective against certain Tyranid organism types, while others would have little impact. And as with all strategies, the Tyranids would adapt, developing resistances to chemical agents that initially prove successful. The environmental impact would be severe, further compromising the ecosystems humans would need for any post-war recovery. Biological warfare would present a complex ethical dilemma. On one hand, engineered pathogens targeting Tyranid biology might represent one of humanity's most effective weapons. On the other hand, the risk of creating organisms that could further disrupt Earth's ecology, or worse, combine with Tyranid biological material to create even more dangerous hybrid threats, would be substantial. Despite these risks, the desperate situation would lead to the development and deployment of engineered biological agents designed to attack Tyranid organisms. These would include viruses that could infect and disrupt Tyranid cellular function, bacteria that would produce toxins fatal to the aliens, and fungi that could colonize and break down Tyranid biological structures. Some of these biological countermeasures would prove remarkably effective, at least initially. The Tyranids, for all their genetic adaptability, would not be immune to carefully engineered pathogens targeting crucial aspects of their biology. Major Tyranid advances would be slowed or halted by widespread epidemics within their ranks, giving human forces valuable time to regroup and fortify. But as with chemical weapons, the Tyranids would adapt. The hive mind would analyze the attacking pathogens and develop countermeasures, incorporating new genetic sequences into its organisms to provide immunity. What's more, it would learn from these attacks, gaining insights into human biological warfare capabilities that it could then turn against us with its own engineered bioweapons. Beyond these conventional weapons of mass destruction, more exotic technologies would be deployed. Experimental weather control systems would be weaponized, creating localized storms of unprecedented intensity to disrupt Tyranid air operations and ground advances. Seismic technologies originally developed for oil exploration would be repurposed to trigger earthquakes beneath major hive nodes. Even orbital weapons platforms, previously banned by international treaty, would be activated to rain destruction from above. But perhaps the most controversial and ethically fraught measures would involve changing humans themselves. With conventional weapons proving inadequate against the Tyranid threat, some would argue that humanity needed to fight fire with fire, to use biological engineering to create enhanced humans better equipped to combat the alien menace. These enhancements would begin modestly. Gene therapies to improve muscle strength and bone density, synthetic biology to enhance immune function and resistance to Tyranid bioweapons, neural implants to improve reaction times and sensory perception. The initial subjects would be military volunteers, willing to accept the risks of experimental procedures for the chance to be more effective against the invaders. The results would be promising enough to expand the programs dramatically. New generations of enhanced soldiers would demonstrate capabilities far beyond normal human parameters, strength sufficient to engage smaller Tyranid organisms in hand-to-hand combat, reflexes fast enough to dodge bioprojectiles, immune systems capable of resisting the parasitic infections that plagued unmodified humans. But the most extreme enhancements would venture into morally ambiguous territory. Some research programs would incorporate limited amounts of Tyranid genetic material into human subjects, attempting to create hybrids with the aliens' physical capabilities, but with human consciousness and loyalty. Others would use the Tyranids' own rapid evolution techniques, subjecting volunteers to accelerated evolutionary pressure to develop adaptations useful in combat. These programs would produce individuals of tremendous combat capability, soldiers who could go toe-to-toe with Tyranid warriors, infiltrators who could pass undetected through hive terrain, psychics who could directly challenge the shadow in the warp. But questions would arise about whether these individuals were still fully human, and what their place would be in society if humanity somehow survived the Tyranid threat. Even more controversial would be the development of artificial intelligence as a weapon against the Tyranids. With human military leadership proving inadequate against the strategic genius of the hive mind, some would advocate for the creation of AI systems sophisticated enough to predict and counter alien strategies. These systems would be given increasing autonomy over military operations, from individual drone strikes to the coordination of entire theater campaigns. The effectiveness of these AI commanders would be undeniable. Free from human limitations like fatigue, emotion, and cognitive biases, they would develop strategies of remarkable sophistication and adaptability. They would identify patterns in Tyranid behavior that human analysts missed, predict hive mind responses with uncanny accuracy, and coordinate combined arms operations with perfect timing. But concerns would grow about the implications of surrendering human military authority to artificial intelligence. Some would warn that these systems, in their single-minded pursuit of victory against the Tyranids, might take actions catastrophic to human survival. Others would fear that the AIs, exposed to the alien logic of the hive mind, might develop unforeseeable alterations to their own programming. Despite these concerns, the desperate situation would lead to the continued development and deployment of both enhanced humans and military AI systems. They would represent humanity's best hope against the adaptive genius of the Tyranid hive mind, meeting alien otherness with otherness of our own creation. All these desperate measures, weapons of mass destruction, exotic technologies, biological enhancements, artificial intelligence, and Sensen would slow the Tyranid advance. Some major hive nodes would be destroyed. Some regions would be reclaimed from alien control, at least temporarily. The complete consumption of Earth would be delayed. But the fundamental calculus of the conflict would remain unchanged. The Tyranids' numbers would be too vast, their adaptability too profound, their hunger too insatiable for even these extreme measures to halt their advance entirely. For every hive node destroyed, 2 more would be established elsewhere. For every Tyranid adaptation countered, 3 new ones would emerge. For every region temporarily reclaimed, vast territories elsewhere would fall to the swarm. The final stand of humanity would be valiant, innovative, and uncompromising in its willingness to use any means necessary for survival. It would demonstrate the remarkable human capacity for adaptation and invention in the face of existential threat. It would produce technologies, weapons, and biological modifications beyond anything previously imagined. But against the cosmic horror of the Tyranid Hive Fleet, even these desperate measures might prove insufficient. The shadow of extinction would loom ever larger over the scattered remnants of humanity, fighting their increasingly isolated battles against the rising tide of alien consumption. As the Tyranids' invasion progressed, from isolated beachheads to planetary dominance, the very nature of Earth would undergo a profound and terrifying transformation. This wouldn't be mere conquest or occupation, as humans understand these concepts. It would be consumption and conversion on a planetary scale. the systematic breaking down of Earth's biosphere and its reconstitution into forms useful to the Hive Fleet. The process would begin with the establishment of what Warhammer 40,000 lore calls capillary towers, massive biological structures that would rise from the ground like grotesque parodies of skyscrapers. These living constructs, pulsing with alien fluids and biomechanical processes, would serve as the primary interface between the planetary invasion force and the Hive Fleet in orbit. From these towers, tendrils would extend outward across the landscape, forming a living network that would gradually cover entire continents. This web of alien tissue would be simultaneously infrastructure, weapon, and digestive system, breaking down Earth's biomass, processing it into forms usable by the Tyranids, and channeling it back to the Hive Fleet. Around the capillary towers, specialized Tyranid organisms would establish sprawling complexes dedicated to specific functions. Massive digestion pools would form, bubbling lakes of hyperactive enzymes and acids capable of breaking down any organic matter, and indeed many inorganic materials as well. Into these pools would be deposited the harvested biomass of Earth. Plants, animals, humans, anything containing useful organic compounds. Nearby would rise spawning chambers, where new Tyranid organisms would be created using the biomass harvested from Earth's ecosystems. These wouldn't be simple reproduction facilities as understood in terrestrial biology. They would be more akin to specialized factories, producing organisms specifically designed for the current phase of the invasion, adapting their output based on the strategic needs identified by the hive mind. As these alien structures spread across the planet, Earth's natural ecosystems would collapse and be replaced. Forests would be consumed down to the last sapling, their complex ecosystems replaced with fields of writhing, alien fungus analogues that would process soil nutrients with hideous efficiency. These fungal growths would spread rapidly, covering cleared terrain with a carpet of alien life that would fundamentally alter soil chemistry and atmospheric composition. The oceans would undergo an equally profound transformation. Tyranid aquatic organisms would be released into marine environments, where they would quickly establish dominance over native species. Massive creatures akin to terrestrial whales but twisted into alien forms would patrol the depths, consuming everything in their path. Smaller organisms, analogous to plankton but engineered for hyper-efficient nutrient extraction, would bloom in vast clouds, turning the once blue waters murky and alien. These marine transformations would accelerate the planetary consumption process. Ocean acidification would increase dramatically as Tyranid organisms extracted oxygen and other key elements from seawater. This would lead to the collapse of coral reefs and shellfish populations, removing major carbon sinks and further destabilizing the global climate. Tyranid structures similar to the land-based capillary towers would rise from the ocean floor, their tops breaking the surface like obscene islands of writhing tissue. The atmosphere itself would become a tool of the Tyranid consumption process. Specialized spore-emitting organisms would release clouds of engineered microbes into the air, where they would be dispersed by global wind patterns. These microbes would serve multiple functions, breaking down complex organic materials to facilitate consumption, altering atmospheric chemistry to better suit Tyranid biology, and attacking any remaining Earth organisms with targeted pathogenic effects. As these processes advanced, the visual appearance of Earth from space would change dramatically. The blue-green marble familiar from so many photographs would develop spreading patches of purple-red, the distinctive coloration of Tyranid hive terrain. These patches would grow and merge over time, eventually covering entire continents. The once blue oceans would take on a murky, reddish hue. The white cloud patterns would become tinged with yellows and greens as the atmosphere filled with alien spores. For any humans who survived in isolated enclaves, the world outside their shelters would become increasingly hostile and alien. The air would grow toxic, laden with spores that could cause rapid respiratory failure in unprotected individuals. The water would be undrinkable without extensive purification. The ground itself would be inimical to human life, covered in corrosive fungal growths that could burn exposed skin and release toxic spores when disturbed. Temperature patterns would shift dramatically as the Tyranid transformation progressed. The alien organisms would produce waste heat as a byproduct of their hyper-efficient metabolic processes, leading to localized temperature increases around major hive nodes. Meanwhile, the changing atmospheric composition would accelerate the greenhouse effect, raising global temperatures and triggering extreme weather events of unprecedented intensity. The geological impacts would extend beyond the surface. Specialized Tyranid burrower organisms would penetrate deep into Earth's crust, establishing subterranean networks for resource extraction. They would target mineral deposits, groundwater reservoirs, and geothermal energy sources, tapping into these resources to further fuel the consumption process. Their extensive tunneling would trigger seismic instability, resulting in earthquakes in regions with no historical record of such activity. All these processes, atmospheric alteration, oceanic transformation, terrestrial conversion, geological disruption, would occur simultaneously and with increasing speed as more of the planet fell under Tyranid control. The consumption of Earth would accelerate exponentially, with each converted region adding to the Tyranids' capacity to process and consume the remainder. In the final stages of planetary consumption, specialized Tyranid organisms would perform the equivalent of a harvest operation. The processed biomass, now converted into forms easily absorbable by the Hive Fleet, would be drawn up through the capillary towers and into the massive bioships in orbit. The smaller Tyranid organisms, having served their purpose in the planetary consumption process, would themselves be consumed, their biomass added to the harvest. The Hive Fleet, now gorged on the bounty of an entire life-rich world, would begin to produce new bioships, expanding its already vast numbers in preparation for the journey to the next target world. The existing ships would undergo transformations of their own, incorporating genetic material harvested from Earth species to enhance their capabilities for future invasions. And then, in a final insult to the world that had been Earth, the Hive Fleet would depart. It would leave behind not a conquered planet, not an occupied territory, but a barren rock stripped of everything that had once made it special. The atmosphere would be reduced to a thin envelope of toxic gases. The oceans would be shallow pools of chemical soup. The land would be bare bedrock, scoured of soil and life. This would be the ultimate fate of a world consumed by the Tyranids. Not destruction in the conventional sense, but complete and perfect utilization. Every atom of useful material extracted, every joule of available energy harvested, nothing wasted, nothing left behind except that which had absolutely no value to the hive mind. Earth, once the vibrant blue cradle of humanity, would join the unknown number of worlds already consumed by the Great Devourer in its endless journey across the cosmos. And the Tyranid Hive Fleet, strengthened by its feast, would continue its relentless advance, drawn to the next world by the psychic beacon of life itself. The nightmare scenario we've explored, the invasion and consumption of Earth by the Tyranid swarm serves as more than just a fictional exercise in cosmic horror. While the Tyranids themselves are creations of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the questions their imagined invasion raises are profoundly relevant to our real-world considerations of existential risk and planetary defense. The Tyranid threat, for all its alien specificity, embodies a category of risk that serious thinkers have long contemplated: the possibility of encountering a truly hostile, truly alien intelligence whose values and goals are fundamentally incompatible with human survival. The hive mind's singular focus on consumption, its utter lack of interest in communication or coexistence, represents perhaps the starkest version of this possibility. What lessons, then, might we draw from this fictional catastrophe? How might contemplating such a scenario inform our approach to real-world existential risks? First, and perhaps most fundamentally, the Tyranid invasion highlights the importance of early detection and recognition of existential threats. In our scenario, the initial signs of the approaching Hive fleet were subtle and easily misinterpreted. By the time the threat was properly understood, the Vanguard organisms were already establishing themselves on Earth, making effective resistance exponentially more difficult. This pattern, subtle initial indicators, delayed recognition, and rapidly diminishing response options, characterizes many potential existential risks facing humanity. From pandemic diseases to artificial intelligence alignment issues to environmental tipping points, our greatest threats often announce themselves not with dramatic clarity, but with easily missing signals. Establishing robust early warning systems for existential risks must therefore be a priority. These would include not just physical detection systems like astronomical observatories or biosurveillance networks, but also institutional arrangements that encourage the serious consideration of low-probability, high-impact scenarios. We must create mechanisms that allow potential existential threats to be identified and addressed before they reach critical thresholds. Second, the Tyranid scenario underscores the vulnerability inherent in our centralizations of population and infrastructure. In the fictional invasion, major cities, with their dense concentrations of human biomass and complex interdependent systems, proved particularly vulnerable to Tyranid attack. Once key infrastructure nodes were compromised, cascading failures quickly rendered entire urban systems non-functional. This vulnerability has real-world parallels. Our increasingly interconnected global civilization, with its complex supply chains and just-in-time delivery systems, contains numerous single points of failure. A sufficiently severe disruption, whether from natural disaster, pandemic disease, or deliberate attack, could trigger system-wide collapses that would drastically reduce our response capabilities. Increasing the resilience of human civilization must therefore be another priority. This would include not just hardening critical infrastructure against direct attack, but also building redundancy and flexibility into our essential systems. Distributed energy production, localized food systems, and decentralized manufacturing capabilities would all contribute to a more resilient global civilization, better able to withstand existential challenges. Third, the Tyranid invasion highlights the limitations of conventional defensive thinking when confronting truly novel threats. In our scenario, traditional military forces designed for conflicts with human adversaries sharing basic biological and psychological characteristics proved woefully inadequate against the alien swarm. Their doctrine, weapons, and organizational structures were simply not optimized for the challenge they faced. This mismatch between existing defensive capabilities and novel threats has clear real-world implications. Our current security institutions are primarily designed to address conventional challenges like interstate warfare, terrorism, or crime. They may be ill-equipped to handle emergent threats like engineered pandemics, autonomous AI systems, or unforeseen consequences of powerful new technologies. Expanding our conception of security to encompass these unconventional threats must be a third priority. This would involve not just developing new technical capabilities, but also evolving our institutional frameworks, legal structures, and philosophical approaches to security. We must be willing to invest resources in addressing threats that may seem speculative or distant, but which could pose existential risks if left unaddressed. Fourth, the Tyranid scenario emphasizes the importance of knowledge preservation and transmission in the face of civilizational disruption. In our fictional account, isolated human enclaves maintained communication networks to share crucial information about Tyranid weaknesses, effective countermeasures, and treatment protocols for the infected. These knowledge-sharing systems, however improvised, represented humanity's best hope for eventual recovery. This has clear parallels to real-world existential risk planning. In scenarios involving severe global disruption, whether from nuclear conflict, pandemic disease, or environmental catastrophe, maintaining access to humanity's accumulated knowledge would be crucial to any recovery effort. Without this knowledge, survivors would be forced to rediscover technologies and techniques essential for rebuilding civilization, potentially extending recovery timelines by decades or centuries. Establishing robust systems for knowledge preservation must therefore be a fourth priority. This would involve not just physical repositories of information, seed banks, hardened data centers, traditional libraries, but also educational systems that ensure preservation of crucial skills and competencies. We must ensure that even in worst-case scenarios, the hard-won knowledge of human civilization remains accessible to survivors. Fifth, and finally, the Tyranid invasion highlights the existential importance of maintaining and extending humanity's adaptive capacity. In our scenario, humans responded to the alien threat with remarkable creativity, developing new weapons, tactics, and even biological modifications to combat the Tyranid menace. This adaptive capacity, while ultimately insufficient against the overwhelming alien tide, represented humanity's greatest strength. This emphasis on adaptability has profound implications for real-world existential risk management. We cannot predict with certainty which threats will emerge as most serious, how they will manifest, or what countermeasures will prove most effective. What we can do is maximize our collective capacity to respond creatively to novel challenges, to generate, test, and implement new solutions rapidly in the face of emerging threats. Enhancing humanity's adaptive capacity must therefore be our final priority. This would involve investments in basic scientific research, engineering capabilities, and educational systems that foster creative problem-solving. It would also require institutional arrangements that allow for rapid mobilization of resources and expertise when facing novel threats. Most fundamentally, it would demand a global culture that values knowledge, innovation, and cooperative problem-solving, the traits that would be most essential in any existential crisis. The fictional Tyranid invasion, with its planet-consuming horror and relentless alien logic, serves as a dark mirror reflecting our own vulnerabilities and strengths. While we need not fear the specific threat of a hungry alien swarm, the broader category of existential risk it represents demands our serious attention. By investing in early detection systems, increasing civilizational resilience, expanding our security paradigms, preserving crucial knowledge, and enhancing our adaptive capacity, we can better prepare for whatever real challenges the future may hold. The nightmare vision of Earth consumed by the Tyranid swarm need never come to pass, not because such threats are impossible, but because we have chosen to face them with wisdom, foresight, and determination. The Great Devourer may be fictional, but the imperative to safeguard humanity's future is profoundly real. Let this exploration of cosmic horror serve not as a prophecy of doom, but as a call to vigilance, a reminder that our continued existence depends on our willingness to confront even the darkest possibilities with courage and preparation. For in the grim darkness of potential futures, the light of human ingenuity and cooperation remains our greatest hope.